Every nation carries its memories in documents, photographs, recordings, and manuscripts. These are all quiet witnesses of the people's journey. These records tell us who we were, how we struggled, and what we achieved, and of course, how our societies were shaped across generations. Preserving these records is not merely a matter of storage. It's an act of safeguarding history itself. Welcome to Archives Alive. I'm Sherwood McCaskey. Thanks for joining us. Archives Alive explores the role that archives play in protecting the memory of our Caribbean civilization. In this, the first episode, we feature one of the region's respected archivists, Dr. Stanley Griffin. He is the head of the Department of Library and Information Studies on the Mona campus of the University of the West Indies. He is an author and an internationally sought-after scholar in the field. Dr. Griffin takes on a modernist approach to archiving. He sees it as not merely preserving what was left behind in the distant past, but more about recognizing and placing great value on the records being produced in our time. These documents that will one day help future generations understand the post-independence story of our Caribbean region. But before he shares his ideas about the future of archiving, Archives Alive poses a personal question about becoming an archivist. You will learn that Dr. Griffin's journey into the world of archives began with a simple curiosity about history and later grew into a commitment to preserving the documented heritage of the Caribbean region. Dr. Griffin?
I was born in Barbados many moons ago, and because of the work of my parents, I grew up around the Caribbean. That movement around the region included places like Jamaica, Haiti, Trinidad and Tobago, Barbados, and ending high school in Belize. It meant then that I've had a very strong interest in Caribbean history, Caribbean culture, Caribbean people, and that interest led me to do all sorts of interesting stuff, right? Starting with an undergraduate degree here at Cave Hill in history, which included courses on Spanish Caribbean history, Brazilian history, the various English-speaking territories, histories of those territories, and so forth. And it so worked out that I was working in the campus library as a student assistant while doing this studying in archaeology and so forth. As I said, under the wonderful tutelage or teaching of Dr. Carl Watson. It so worked out that I came to the archives as a student here at the Barbados Department of Archives, and we did a course that I never forgot, entitled Techniques of Historical Investigation, and he showed the connections between the archival records and the various parts and places of Barbados. In other words, he connected the archives to these very living spaces. That resonated strongly for me, and as part of my future life, I ended up doing the new program, then at the time, the Master of Philosophy, the MPhil research degree in Cultural Studies. That connection, however, to culture, again linked to the archives. While I was aware that there was a migration of West Indians to Panama, at one point to Brazil, there was also a migration to the Dominican Republic during the late 1800s and early 1900s. And included in that migration were persons and families from Antigua and other parts of the English-speaking Leeward Islands, as it was. So a number of these Spanish-speaking migrants to Antigua in the late 1990s, early 2000s were descendants of Antiguans who went to the Dominican Republic to cut cane, and for whatever reason they stayed. And so part of my personal academic interest in intra-Caribbean migration dynamics was also tied to this growing interest in archives. Now, archives is the starting point for culture. All right? At one point, the National Archives of the US used to have a tagline, America starts here. They argued that because they are the custodians of the US Constitution, the concept of the American citizen starts and is safeguarded by the archives. Now, I want to get into the politics of recent activities where the US government is concerned, but there was a move made that affected the National Archives in the USA that would have affected the concept of citizenship. Same here at the Barbados Department of Archives. The concept of who we are as Barbadians starts at the archives. Every aspect of our history has some form of documentary evidence at the Barbados Department of Archives. In other territories, for celebrations of Carnival, the costume ideas came from a visit to that National Archives. In other words, you can't have any form of cultural development without a strong reliance on the archives. This is a challenge though. The archives at the Barbados Department of Archives is very traditional. Dare I say colonial. Records, paper, boxes, shelves. But the totality of Barbadian culture is not tied to paper. You can't put it in a box. You can't shelve it in a room. And so there are aspects of Barbadian culture that now need to be captured if the Barbados Department of Archives is truly to reflect the various developments, the growth, the maturity of the Barbadian nation. And in other words, as I've said in a review of another territorial archives, the archives didn't done in 17 something something when the British left. The archives did not end on the night of independence. The archives grew into something else. And so the challenge now is for the National Archives to truly reflect the post-independent self, the post-Republican self, right? The major challenge, however, is, thanks to the colonial experience, we were trained to deal with paper in box on shelf in a room. Other forms of archiving teach us that paper, box, shelf, and room is not archives. Archives are living. Every time you tell a story, that story is the archive. And so now the challenge for National Archives like the Barbadian Department of Archives is to move not away, but to move towards including other forms of documentation, other methodologies of documentation, to capture the other aspects that you can't put on paper, in a box, on a shelf, in a room. Interestingly enough, a position opened at the University of the West Indies University Archives in Jamaica around the same time that I was winding down my doctoral studies. Interestingly enough, I made the cut and I moved to Jamaica. While I was waiting on my doctoral defense, the opportunity came for me to do my archival masters online with the University of Dundee. And so again, my career developed between my doctoral academic work and now my professional level work as an archivist. It so happened that there were lots of changes taking place in the university system at the time, and there really was a need to have greater access to university records. I could basically say that at that time, the university was in several major transitionary modes, and precedent and evidence was crucial to some of the decision making. So I could tell you, as the archivist on the ground, when the university decided to open the Faculty of Sport, I was downstairs in the archives at a meeting, and the registrar came down and said, "We need a faculty color, Stanley. Pull up the decisions on university colors." So I pulled the Rex Nettleford Committee on Academic Dress, 1965, just in time for the first university graduation. And we went through the colors, and the color gold was not there. And so, the Faculty of Sport, the color for the Faculty of Sport will be gold. And so because of the work that I was doing, I was able to be part of the decision making that was taking place at that time. And that's just one small instance. So my task then was to prepare the university's records for greater retrieval time, right? So rather than searching through minutes and papers for weeks, it now became a matter of days and hours. So my academic work as a PhD was, tied into, and my experience was tied into making the university's records accessible. In 2012, 2013, UNESCO sponsored an effort by the Department of Library and Information Studies to develop graduate programs in archives and records management. I was part of the committee of experts to, one, make a decision as to whether it was possible for the university to teach archives and records management, two, to decide on what form this program will take, and three, to design courses. I was one of the younger persons around the table, and as life would have it, while I was running the university archives, I became one of the first lecturers in the new Masters of Archives and Records Management. One of the focus areas of the new Masters was that it must be Caribbean. One of the challenges I have had as a student of archives elsewhere was that you needed to have a grounding in the history and culture in order to appreciate and understand the ways in which archiving happened. Now, University of Dundee is a Scottish university. Sadly, in my time, we don't learn Scottish history here. So I had kind of difficulty, trying to figure out Scottish history with Scottish archiving culture. But the premise still applied. If you're going to do archives in the Caribbean, you must have a strong appreciation for Caribbean culture. You must have a strong appreciation for Caribbean history. The only way those two will connect is because of the way in which we live our lives and understand ourselves and document ourselves. A man don't sing a calypso because he just wants to sing a song, right? It's a form of documentation. Or artworks. So in my Dundee Masters, I should say, my research paper looked at Rastafari of Jamaica and the ways in which the Rastafari community documented themselves and created their own, let's call it an archive, all right? Now, interestingly, because of the history, the Rastafari don't really have a good vibe in the archives. There's a file called Sedition in St. Thomas, which was basically stating that there is this community of Rastafarianism, that they're living off the grid, they're anti-colonial, they're talking about back to Africa, and we need to get rid of these people. And when you read that file in the National Archives, you kind of get a sense that, you know, this was something to control, something to oppress. But interestingly, and we all know Rastafari now, right? We all know, we have a general sense of that ital living, that culture. And so Rastafari used their own cultural ways of keeping information, the reasoning, which is their coming together to share and worship and so forth, as a means of documenting themselves. It so happened that as part of my Dundee training, we did a course on community archives and how communities have a way of documenting themselves. And I looked at that experience of the Rastafari, especially the Rastafari experience in Montego Bay, which is slightly different to the Rastafari experience in Kingston. And the Montego Bay Rastafari was using their own cultural ways of speaking amongst themselves and sharing information to document their experiences. And again, this idea of culture, this idea of memory, and this idea of Caribbean shaped my own understanding of, what a Caribbean archive can look like.
As Dr. Griffin continues the discussion, he turns his attention to the staff of the Department of Archives here in Barbados. He emphasized the need to develop a new generation of archivists, professionals equipped with the skills, vision, and adaptability required to meet the demands of the modern archival landscape. Dr. Griffin?
Archives are a part of what we refer to as an information ecosystem in every society. One way to understand it is by taking a look at your own personal house, a photo album. Some people would even have an envelope with the birth paper, the land paper, the car mortgage, the bank accounts. Is either an envelope under the bed or in a drawer, in some cabinet inside the house. Every family has that. The National Archives is that envelope in a house for a nation. The National Library focuses on publications, published information, in the very way every house would have a set of books on a settee somewhere that persons like to make reference to. These institutions, the museum, everybody have a favorite cup. Everybody have a favorite item that is personal, having sentimental value. So the museum basically captures evidence of material culture, these items that speak to our own experiences, our own meanings. And so the information ecosystem includes the various ways in which people document themselves, give value to items about themselves and so forth. And so in this 21st century, we're also doing that digitally. We're using social media, we're using websites, we're using blogs. Human behavior don't change. The technology just changes how we use it, right? So we're using the digital technology to do basically the same thing as creating diaries, making newspaper reports and so forth. The National Archives, the archival sector, and the work of the archivists helped with preserving, capturing, making available, and making accessible, preserving the various unpublished aspects about ourselves. Those things that you have in your envelope at your house. We need a generation of archivists now to manage things. We also need a generation of archivists who can do digital archives. The archives training that I did at University of Dundee predates digital archiving. I graduated in 2015, right? It's now 2025, 26. The kinds of things I learned in archive school then, outdated now. Miss Duke practices digital archiving. I have never done it. I can't teach it anymore, so she don't teach some of my courses. In other words, folks, y'all are young and strong, and the old-time things no longer apply. Right? And if you're going to be effective, relevant, useful, you need to upgrade yourself. And a possibility is happening right now. In my time, 10 years ago, I had to study at Dundee, online, and pay pounds. You can study at Mona, online, right from here, and pay in what? Bajan, right? And so the program, quite frankly, focuses on Caribbean realities. My studies focused on Scottish realities, Scottish culture. We talk about Caribbean culture as archival. So we connect the paper, the historical paper, with the culture. We have a course called Memory and Record Keeping that looks at, Memory and Record Keeping that in the Caribbean that looks at our cultural practices as record keeping. A man don't sing a calypso because he wants to sing a song. A calypso is a record of an experience of a particular time and place. And it therefore means Caribbean archives need to be able to capture and document and make available aspects of our culture as record keeping. So chances are the privilege is now yours, unlike previous generations who worked inside here, who were only taught that the paper is archival. We're now at the stage where we now think about dance as archival. We're at the stage where we think of music, we think of stories as archival. One of my students did a paper on Vibes Cartel as Caribbean archives. You know about Vibes Cartel, right? Yes. Surely. It's supposed to be. Right? More than a coloring book. You know about that, right? And how the tattoos were stories of a Jamaican experience that must be documented and captured and therefore made available. Another person looked at Trinidadian Cambole, how that experience with Carnival helped to shape our understanding and documentations of self. Another person, I have students doing all sorts of things. Literally things that we took for granted and things that are not on paper. Half of our culture is not inside here. Half of our history is not inside here. Here is the beginning. It is connected to other things, but we need to capture the other things. We must redefine what is an archive for us. We must redefine what is the archival responsibility for us. And we must re-resource. In other words, we can't just give the National Archives boxes, shelves, rooms, hopefully with air condition, and say, that's your responsibility. We now need to be able to record audiovisually. We now need to have servers. We now need to have greater sovereignty of our data. We now need to ensure there's a legislative framework to protect our own information. We now need to ensure that we have our own standards of care. We cannot continue to adopt and import best practices which were designed for them, but not for us, and their own interests and not ours. So we need to develop our capacity then to really document ourselves, safeguard ourselves in order for us to resource and inform our future selves. If not, our concept of archives will remain stuck in the 1900s, and as our society develops and advances, that society will not recognize the archives. Already in the Caribbean, we have this challenge with finding the archives relevant. I make reference to this all the time. One of our PhD students is looking at this concept that the archives that we have were literally left behind as rubbish, because they took all the good stuff and they said, that's yours. And now we've had to find meaning with what was left. Chances are we ought not to leave ourselves in the rubbish bin. We ought to be able to document ourselves in the ways that truly reflect who and what we are. That's the challenge of this Barbados Department of Archives. That's the challenge of the University of the West Indies, Department of Library and Information Studies, by ensuring that we develop professionals and academics who can speak to how Caribbean people document themselves in ways that are truly Caribbean, in order to create and promote a professionalism that is Caribbean.
Well, thank you very much, sir. Dr. Griffin's presentation was both a reflection and an urgent call to action. In his inimitable style, he reminded all that archives are not simply about the past, but more about shaping how the Caribbean will be remembered in the future. And so, with that charge from one of the region's respected archivists, the first chapter of Archives Alive comes to a thoughtful and inspiring close. I'm Sherwood McCaskey. Thanks for your time.